In the chilling depths of the Cold War, a new threat emerged that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. This was a time when two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in a bitter rivalry, each vying for global dominance, each armed with a lethal arsenal of nuclear weapons. The world was a chessboard, and each move was calculated, each strategy designed to checkmate the other. The Cold War wasn't just about military might, though. It was a battle of ideologies, a struggle between capitalism and communism, democracy and dictatorship, freedom and oppression. It was a war fought not on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of people, in the corridors of power, and in the secret recesses of intelligence agencies. And then, in the midst of this tense standoff, came a startling revelation. In the sun-drenched Caribbean island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles. The discovery sent shockwaves through Washington. It was a daring and provocative move by the Soviets, a clear escalation of the Cold War. The missiles in Cuba could reach major American cities in mere minutes, leaving little time for retaliation. The balance of power had been upset, and the stakes were now higher than ever. As the news of the missiles broke, the atmosphere in Washington became charged with tension and dread. The White House was a hive of activity, with advisors and military officials huddled in urgent meetings. The President John F. Kennedy faced the most severe crisis of his presidency. The choice before him was stark: to strike or not to strike, to risk war or to appear weak. And so, as the world watched with bated breath, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves on the precipice of war. Each side was waiting for the other to blink, each side prepared to unleash hell if the other dared to cross the line. As the world held its breath, 13 tense days began that would decide the fate of humanity. The clock was ticking. Each decision, each moment could be the difference between peace and global catastrophe. As the clock struck midnight on October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was informed of the Soviet Union's missile installations in Cuba. This marked the beginning of a 13-day standoff that would come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first few days were filled with uncertainty and fear. The U.S. had to decide how to respond, and quickly. Would they opt for a diplomatic approach or take military action? The stakes were high and the world was watching. By the fourth day, the tension had reached a boiling point. Kennedy had established a blockade around Cuba, effectively isolating it from the rest of the world. This was a bold move, but it was also a risky one. The Soviets could see this as an act of war and retaliate. The world held its breath. On the seventh day, a glimmer of hope emerged. The Soviets agreed to negotiate, but only if the US promised not to invade Cuba. It was a small victory, but it was still a long way from resolution. The following days were a nerve-wracking game of diplomatic chess. Each side tried to outmaneuver the other, all while trying to avoid triggering a nuclear war. The world watched as the two superpowers danced around each other, each one trying to gain the upper hand. The tension reached its peak on the 12th day. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and the US was on the brink of retaliating. But, in a surprising turn of events, Kennedy decided against it. Instead, he increased diplomatic efforts, hoping to resolve the situation peacefully. As the crisis deepened, the world watched, waited, and worried. The crisis had been averted, and the world could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As the clock struck midnight on October 29th, the crisis had officially ended. As the crisis deepened, the world watched, waited, and worried. From Tokyo to London, from Buenos Aires to Delhi, the world watched in fear and anticipation. As the globe teetered on the brink of nuclear war, every corner of the world held its breath. In the heart of Europe, the streets of Paris were filled with protesters, their voices echoing off the ancient stone buildings as they demanded peace. Across the English Channel, Britons anxiously tuned into their radios, their ears straining to catch the latest news from across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in Asia, the bustling markets of Tokyo fell silent, the usually vibrant city holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move in this high-stakes chess match. India, a young nation still finding its footing, watched with trepidation, acutely aware of the potential fallout. The tension was palpable even in the southern hemisphere. In Buenos Aires, Argentinians gathered around their television sets, their faces illuminated by the flickering light as they watched the drama unfold in real time. Governments across the globe convened emergency meetings, their leaders huddled around tables laden with maps and reports. The United Nations held its breath. its chambers filled with the anxious whispers of representatives from 117 countries, each one aware of the weight the next decision could carry. The media too played its part in this global drama. Newspapers splashed bold headlines across their front pages, their ink barely dry as they flew off the presses. Radio stations interrupted their regular programming with urgent updates, their static-filled broadcasts the only link for many to the unfolding crisis. And in every home, in every city, in every country, people could do little but wait for news, wait for reassurances, wait for a resolution. The world was united not by a common language or culture, but by a shared fear and a collective hope for peace. Inside the White House, President Kennedy and his advisors grappled with the weight of their decisions. It was a weight felt by every soul on the planet, a burden shared by all humanity during those 13 tense days. The pressure was immense, the stakes unimaginable. Inside the White House, President Kennedy and his advisors grappled with the weight of the world on their shoulders. The clock was ticking, each second bringing us closer to a potential nuclear catastrophe. In the hallowed halls of this iconic building, a battle of minds was raging. The Kennedy administration was torn between two options: a direct military strike on the missile sites in Cuba, which could potentially spark World War III, or a naval blockade of the island, a show of force that might be seen as a mere slap on the wrist. Behind closed doors, the president and his advisors deliberated. The room was filled with tension as they wrestled with the implications of their decisions. Every choice carried the risk of escalation, of pushing the world further towards the brink of nuclear war. Among the voices in the room, two stood out. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara advocated for the blockade, arguing that it would buy them time and maintain a position of strength without resorting to outright aggression. On the other hand, General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, pushed for a direct strike, a decisive action that would eliminate the threat once and for all. In the end, Kennedy chose the path of restraint, opting for the naval blockade. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice in a high-stakes game of nuclear poker, then a breakthrough, a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times. In a world on the edge, a lifeline was thrown. As the clock ticked down, hope seemed as elusive as a specter. But then, the tide began to turn. The pivotal moments that marked the crisis's de-escalation were as dramatic as any spy novel. Hushed whispers of secret negotiations filled the corridors of power. The Kremlin and the White House, once on a collision course, sought a peaceful resolution behind closed doors. President Kennedy, bearing the weight of the world, took to the airwaves. His address to the nation was more than a speech, it was a plea for sanity in a world teetering on the brink of nuclear destruction. His words echoed across the globe, a beacon of hope in a turbulent sea of uncertainty. And then, the unimaginable happened. The crisis began to de-escalate. The world paused, caught its breath, and exhaled. But the echoes of those 13 days would reverberate for years to come. The crisis was over, but its impact was far-reaching. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in international relations, compelling world powers to confront the chilling reality of nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union, realizing the potential for global destruction, began to rethink their strategies. In the aftermath, both nations took steps to prevent such a crisis from happening again. This led to the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, a significant milestone in the history of nuclear disarmament. This agreement banned all test detonations of nuclear weapons except for those conducted underground, marking a pivotal step towards reducing nuclear proliferation. The crisis also highlighted the importance of diplomatic negotiations in resolving conflicts, setting a precedent for future international crises. And perhaps most importantly, it served as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in a world bristling with nuclear arms. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of peace in a nuclear age. In the end, the crisis was averted, but at what cost? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a stark reminder of the razor-thin line between peace and global catastrophe. Lessons were learned, yes, but at a price that left the world holding its breath. The crisis underscored the power of diplomacy, the necessity of communication, and the value of human life above political gain. As we look back, we are reminded of the importance of peace, understanding, and the fragile nature of our world.